In my previous somewhat provocative video, I said I never use a pencil when woodworking. Well, of course that's not strictly true, as I have a pencil to hand occasionally, but let's say it's not my naturally preferred tool most of the time. Now today I'm going to demonstrate different ways of marking wood in different woodworking situations and show the traditional methods. I did, after all, train in traditional cabinet making skills, so I ought to know what they are. And I'm going to cover ways of marking across the spectrum of woodworking crafts, not just joinery or fine furniture making, but other craft disciplines such as musical instruments, boat building and outdoor structures, where there are variants such as light and dark and wet and dry timbers, and of course different accuracy demands. And not to mention that some wooden objects are showpieces where the tools used in the process are considered to be as important as the end product. Well, according to some. When I was invited to make a cabinet to sell at Sotheby's auction house in 1980, the purchaser wouldn't have cared one iota that I'd used a ballpoint pen for much of the marking out, and obviously I didn't leave the lines on for all to see. So, at the end of this video, I'll briefly show a clearer comparison between a pencil and a ballpoint pen, and actually you might be in for a surprise. So let's start with an everyday, very basic item of woodwork, a simple box, which might be nailed together. A chop saw or similar will quickly cut the prepared wood, so just one clear mark is needed. A pencil is fine, and probably a soft pencil which shows up clearly, but a fine felt tip pen can also be used. Just bear in mind a felt tip pen soaks into the fibres and is more difficult to clean up. Now if you're making the box with a handsaw, a clearer marking tool is needed because sawdust can obliterate the line. As a general rule in woodworking, lines are usually removed by planing and sanding, but if there's to be no protective coating such as a lacquer, there may be no need to remove the lines at all. I must admit it's habit of pride in workmanship that I always remove the lines. That leads me on to mention the marking knife and where it should or shouldn't be used. A marking knife line cannot be removed, as obviously it scores through the wood fibres. It's also not at all clear to see, and it should be used only for cutting veneer or specific traditional hand-making applications such as on shoulder lines for carcasses and drawer dovetails. With drawer making or any cabinetry, the marking knife is used with a tri-square to scribe the shoulder line. Now only part of that line is cut, so in particular with a drawer where you want a piston fit, you don't want to plane a lot of the wood off to remove the marked line, so you start with a very fine scored line and then deepen it where it will be a cut line. Now this deeper cut allows a channel for the chisel tip to sit into for trimming the joint. Now marking knives come in a variety of forms, including scalpels, and the traditional marking knife, I must say, has the most solid feel to it. Moving on from the marking knife, but staying with the dovetail joint, this joint is a copy joint, unlike a mortise and tenon, where marking out is done on the separate pieces. With the dovetail joint, the tails are marked and cut out first, and the pins are then copied from the tails. Now traditionally, a dovetail scriber is used, and generally it's hard to see the marks. So a pencil can be used, and 2H is normally used in cabinetry, and it has to be sharpened to a shallow angle. So it's quite a delicate instrument. Before leaving the dovetail joint, dividers can be used for stepping off and marking distances. Other marking tools are marking and mortise gauges and the cutting gauge. Now the marking gauge has a single point and marks parallel lines along the grain. If you use it across the grain, the fibres will simply tear. So for that, a cutting gauge is used for parallel lines across the grain because it has a blade rather than a point, and there are lots of variations to this tool. It's occasionally used on wide boards, but the English traditional preference is to use a tri-square and marking knife. A mortise gauge, as the name suggests, is for marking out mortises to the width of the mortise chisel. In musical instrument making, a pencil is used, and also a scalpel. For the guitars that I make, and in particular in my acoustic guitar easy build ebook, the videos show a ballpoint pen being used, but a pencil could also be used. A combination of hand and power tools are used, so some flexibility in marking tools is only logical. Again, the marking knife is used for scoring the critical angle for the neck joint, and the purpose is to allow the chisel to sit into the line. Now, if really dark wood is used, I sometimes use masking tape as a background for a clear line. But of course there are white charcoal pencils available, and these should not contain wax, which would present a problem when finishing. For outdoor work, the tolerances are going to be much greater than joinery or fine furniture making, and the wood might be wet. If a carpenter's pencil or ballpoint pen doesn't do the job, then perhaps you can use a permanent ink marker. When I built this riverside bird hide, I used whatever was at hand generally, and I had a tendency to drop whatever I was using, so a bright coloured ballpoint pen tended to be my favoured marking tool. Now, in boat building, generally any marking tool that stands out is sufficient. Epoxy glue that's thickened with microbeads is as much a filler as a bonding agent, so the tolerances in boat building are greater, maybe as much as 1/4 of an inch. And this horses for courses approach to marking is best demonstrated here, because boats are generally a lot more expensive than items of furniture, but the choice of marking implements seems to be more pedantic in fine furniture making. Now, with the electrically powered micro catamaran that I built, I must admit my cabinet making background influenced me to work to quite tight tolerances, because actually it's just as quick to saw accurately, because in woodwork you should always get it right first time. And I use both a pencil and a ballpoint pen, the latter being clearer. So this brings me to the final brief comparative test between a pencil and a ballpoint pen. And I have to admit I was wrong in the first video to suggest only the most expensive ballpoint pens should be used. The cheapest in my range was the best, and I tested a sample range, and I also looked at mechanical pencils. Well, yes, they're nice things to own, but to say the lead doesn't break when it drops on the floor, well, thanks for watching.